of all the subjects or topics in the world, menstruation must surely be the most biosocial. And as Chris suggested, I'm pretty much a biosocial anthropologist. So menstruation is referring to the discharge of blood and fluids from the wombs of reproductive age females, which happens at approximately monthly intervals. And the Latin word menses that refers to menstruation is also talking about months. But as Chris may have said in an earlier lecture or another occasion, the root of this word menses, menstruation, month and moon, it all goes back to an Indo-European, Proto-Indo-European root, mer, which is actually also the root of man, of measurement. So all of these ideas and concepts go, they pile on top of this, of menstruation. And menstruation, in addition to being a biological phenomenon, it has probably more than almost any other aspect of kind of human physiology, has cultural elaboration as well. As Chris, I'm going to do another lecture later in the term, in December sometime, when I will focus very much on the aspects of cultural elaboration, particularly in relation to the origins of Homo sapiens art and the very first art. But in this lecture, I'm going to look at the biological facts of menstruation and what that might tell us about hominin, our ancestral human ancestors, their social life and mating systems. And I'm going to set up a model and an argument why it is that menstruation became the absolute pivoting signal into human symbolic culture. Now, menstruation did not evolve in the first place as a signal, as something communicative. It evolved for other reasons. But once it was a very salient aspect of female human ancestral reproductive cycles, it took on, my argument is, it took on a communicative aspect. And it really, in all human cultures, it's never lost that. It can't, because it's one of the most important signals of humankind, actually. And I'm going to explain why it is. But menstruation is kind of, it is from a scientific point of view, from a physiological point of view, it is a bit of a mystery why it should evolve. There have been a number of hypotheses about it which haven't been particularly satisfactory. If you think about it, the shedding of the inner lining of the womb, the tissue from the endometrium, it's incredibly, this is tissue that has taken a lot of energy and nutrients to build up and prepare, and then that is all apparently going to waste, to the point that it can be affecting a woman's health. So this seems to be a really costly process. So biologists are always interested in, well, why is that happening? From a point of view of evolution, why did evolution come up with this? And it's a bit of a mystery why it should be. But I'm going to try and explain, and with a bit of help from a nice little TED video as well, the up-to-date, currently most satisfactory model of why menstruation's there at all. And in order to do that, we actually need to explore, well, which species do menstruate, and we don't just need to explain the evolution of menstruation amongst humans, but why is it amongst those other species as well, in particular? That's what a good explanation should allow us to do. But I just want to add in, for those who are sort of more social anthropologists, menstruation has a bit of a role, I believe, in human culture, biology and culture, that Levi-Strauss, if some of you have heard of Levi-Strauss, if any of you were here last week when Robin was talking with Chris, Claude Levi-Strauss used to talk about the incest taboo in this way. He pinpointed the incest taboo as the point between nature and culture. And actually, because the incest taboo was on the other, incest avoidance was on the other hand, on one hand, universal, but as you came into culture, all the particular rules became particular and specific according to culture. Well, we can say really the same thing about menstruation. It's a material phenomenon, which is an aspect of behaviour in nature, but it is also in culture an aspect of belief. And the many particular beliefs about menstruation are very basic to human cultures. So it really links together a Darwinian level of analysis of evolutionary anthropology with a kind of symbolic anthropology, an anthropology that wants to understand ideology, cultural beliefs, and so forth. And I think it's the absolute crux of that linkage. So we're going to just, I'll just give a very brief outline for anybody who's not clear, but most people will know that. A recent paper on the evolution of menstruation, Alverne and Tabor, brings this useful diagram with the 4 kind of phases of a menstrual cycle. You'll notice that 28-day scale on the bottom. I'm going to blow that out of the water by the end of the lecture. But 2 basic phases in the ovarian cycle. First phase, follicular, as the follicles develop towards ovulation, correlating with the production of on the second row, the hormonal production of estrogen. Ovulation somewhere in the middle of the cycle. We'll find out more about that. And then the last phase, the luteal phase, with the development of corpus luteum to facilitate, with progesterone as the key hormone, to facilitate the embedding of a fertilized ovum and implanting of an embryo. So menstruation occurs if there is no such implantation, and then progesterone withdrawn, and menstruation occurs. That's the basic outline, just to help people work that out. Okay, so we're now going to ask which species, why did it evolve, and which species are the menstruating species. So we're just going to have a look at that, because that would help us to answer the question of why is it those species, and therefore why is it in humans, kind of thing, in human ancestry. So we are looking at a kind of cross-section block of the human placenta, so the organ surrounding the fetus that implants and buries itself into the wall of the womb, the uterus. And we are among the species which has what is known as a Hema Coryell. It is an extraordinarily invasive form of placentations. There are other far less invasive forms of placentation amongst mammals, but we have the very most invasive. And when I say invasive, it is very highly aggressive. Effectively, the fetus gains, it becomes very contiguous to the mother's bloodstream, and ultimately gains control over the mother's bloodstream. Now, most mammals, particularly some marsupial mammals, most mammals will make sure that the fetus is one side of a wall and the mother's bloodstream is another. But in these Hema Coryell species, that isn't the case. The fetus is able to rip through the uterine wall, burrow in there, mine into the uterine arteries, and it's doing that in order to gain an increased level of blood supply. It's doing that in order to grab all the nutrients it can get, and it uses hormonal signals to change the quality and the quantity of the mother's blood supply that's coming to it. So it is not a well-behaved fetus at all. And what we're looking at with this type of placentation, the model that is used to try to understand it, is a maternal fetal conflict model. Okay, this sounds very counterintuitive. Why on earth would the mother and the fetus have conflicts of interest? They seem that they should be wanting to work together in beautiful harmony and coordination, but in fact there are potentially conflicts of interest between the mother and the fetus. So we're going to go into that. Okay, so Hema Coryell species is one aspect of the menstruating species now, but it isn't necessarily explaining all the species. It isn't necessary because, some Hema Coryell species, which include rodents, for instance, rabbits, some of my favourite animals, and horses would be examples, do not menstruate, but they have this highly invasive placentation. So let's just take a look at exactly which species are menstruating. So this is a big family tree. I haven't got a pointer here, which shows to us, so we're looking in red, the pinky red tells you species that are menstruating. I don't expect you to know all the posh Latin names for the species, the Linnaean classifications, but we're basically looking at the order primates, the order of primates, and amongst the order of primates, it's likely to have evolved either down here or down here. And these two branches include a number of the New World, the South American, Central American monkeys, and this is the Old World monkeys with all the apes over there. So it's basically across most of the New World monkeys, not all, there seems to have been a bit of sort of reverse evolution, and in the Old World and monkeys and apes. So anthropoid apes are menstruating. Chiroptera, I don't know if anybody knows what that is, these are species of bats. Okay, so a sum of, and there looks as though there could have been 2 points, possibly, or 1 point in the ancestry where menstruation evolved, potentially. And so, yeah, we need to know much more about bat evolution to find out some of this. And it's very interesting that bats happen to menstruate because bats are very symbolic in many cultures of they're creatures hanging upside down. They're often associated to blood or the moon and so forth. Yeah, it's very interesting that they actually, and doubtless indigenous peoples, in drawing on the symbolism of bats, are well aware that they have this feature. Over there, Afrotheria is a very big superorder of mammals that includes things like elephants, it includes things like sea cows, but the species which is documented as menstruating is the tiny little elephant shrew. That little pink bit is the elephant shrew there. And it's a bit of the jury's out on the elephant shrew, but there is some 1940s literature on its menstrual cycles, and that's kind of very interesting whether that's really going to hold up or not. But those are our menstruating species. Okay, so a good explanation will tell us why should it be these species. That's what we kind of need to explain. All of them have the Hema Coryell invasive form of placentation. But as I said, not all Hema Coryell species will have menstruation. We've mentioned the rabbits and the horses and so on. So there's got to be something more going on with these species. And anybody who wants to do a PhD in bat reproduction is a very strong recommendation that we find out a lot more about it. But let's just look at this model of this new model of menstruation. I'll be able to explain it using what's known as maternal fetal conflict theory. So this was developed back in the 90s by a guy called David Haig, originally in relation to human pregnancy. And why on earth should there be conflict between the mother and the fetus? It seems like there must be. The fetus is relying on the mother desperately wants to give birth to a healthy offspring. Why shouldn't they be, completely sharing interests? Well, they share a lot. They share 50% of their genes. But there's another 50% of their genes that's coming from a totally different individual, the father. And so they don't have a perfect confluence of interest at all. Now, a mother is, she, ideally, everything being equal, a mother would expect to want to share out between all her offspring roughly equal resources. She'd want to she doesn't want any one offspring to completely exhaust her for resources at the expense of another. But from the point of view of the fetus, who really doesn't know if it's 100% related to, how closely related to the other siblings it is it the same father, for instance? The fetus doesn't know that. All the fetus knows is this is its one chance of life. And so from the fetus's point of view, it really wants to hang on in there. It really wants to get all it can take. Okay. There are many aspects of pregnancy which become much easier to explain if we take a maternal-fetal conflict model. We can start to explain, for instance, morning sickness during the first trimester as the fetus producing a particular hormone, HC. It correlates with the production of a particular hormone, HCG, chorionic gonadotrophin, is the hormone. When the fetus really puts a huge volume of this hormone, and it's interpreted as a kind of shout the fetus is signaling to the mother, I am a really healthy fetus, have me. It's showing off its kind of good health, if you like, by that. Now, morning sickness may be relatively benign, but as I've said, the fetus is capable of producing hormones which can alter the blood pressure of the mother and the amounts of the quantity of blood that's coming from the mother across the uterine wall to the placenta, but also the quality of the blood by increasing insulin levels and getting greater blood sugar into the blood, then this will actually have the possibility, ramifications of hurting the mother's health. Now, in the case of blood pressure, so blood pressure raises during pregnancy for a normal healthy woman. But if a woman, so raised blood pressure, most women can cope with that. But if a woman is any health compromised, then as she approaches birth, a very high raised blood pressure can lead to such risks as preeclampsia, which can be a life-threatening, affecting maternal and infant mortality. And in the case of raising the levels of placental lactogen, which raises insulin levels, this can lead to what's known as gestational diabetes, diabetes associated with pregnancy. For a woman that is kind of healthy in the sort of range of normal health, that may be okay, but for a woman that's compromised in any way with diabetes, this could be very life-threatening. So many of the ills of pregnancy, which kind of happen normally for like every woman maybe that gets pregnant, for some women, this tug of war, this conflict going on between the mother and the fetus, if both parties are relatively healthy, then it kind of works out in the end, this tugging and pulling of the fetus trying to grab more resources and the mother kind of trying to restrict its resources. But if either the mother or the fetus has some health issues, then the thing can collapse. It may not work. Now, in the case of the fetus losing out there, that is the fetus's only chance of life. But for the mother, okay, there are numerous losses of implantations going on for most women trying to get pregnant. It doesn't always happen perfectly, and there will be many chances pregnancies may be lost. So the mum can try again. She's got the chance to try again next time or the next time. So there's different odds for both parties. And this means the fetus is going to be trying incredibly hard and may pull too hard in this tug of war. This is the maternal-fetal conflict theory. Okay, so if we've got that picture of pregnancy as a kind of conflict zone, not total conflict, because obviously there are shared interests, but basically as maternal-fetal tug of war. How does this work? What does this say about menstruation? We've already heard how this fetus is really, it is a little alien blighter that is going to tunnel through the mother's uterine walls, grab control of her bloodstream, take over take over with hormonal signals and manipulation of her health for a large chunk of her reproductive lifespan. She's going to lose control to this little alien, little fetus creature, which means that for certain species of these Hema Coryell species who have extremely costly investment in pregnancy and in giving birth, and I'm pointing especially to the primate species, for those species, the mother has a way, the adaptation is for the mother to clamp down and kind of preempt what that fetus is going to do in plugging into her bloodstream. So how does she do this? She does this through the preparation of the lining of the womb, the endometrium. Now, all these Hema Coryell mammals, mammals in the preparation of the endometrium for implantation have a process known as Dissidia, which differentiates the cell structure and prepares the amount of the blood supply that's available too. For the other Hema Coryell mammals that we talked about, like rabbits, for instance, I like using them as an example, rabbits, it's very hard for a female rabbit not to get pregnant. They're famous for it. And the reason for that is she ovulates when she gets mated. It's called induced ovulation. The male mates the rabbit, the female just pops the egg there, and it's all very efficient, beautiful, so well organized. For primates and us, as one of the primates, and apparently for bats too, and the elephant shrews, we don't do that. We don't do that. We especially, as I'm going to come on to, we make ovulation a very, it might happen or it might not. We certainly don't ovulate every time we have sex. You can imagine what kind of problems that would lead to. And we're really hiding it from males. So we don't have this, we don't have this definitely going to get pregnant thing at all. We might get pregnant, we might not. But the point is about the decidualization here, whereas rabbits or other Hema Coryell mammals will only go into the decidualization if they actually do get pregnant. For these other species which menstruate, they do what's known as, long word, spontaneous decidualization, which means they prepare the ground of the endometrium anyway. They do it as a matter of preemptive precautions against the possibility that that embryo is going to implant and that they're going to get pregnant. So this means that the endometrium will build up, prepare itself, and if the implantation happens, okay, the pregnancy goes. But what menstruation is if the implantation doesn't happen, progesterone withdrawn, menstruation happens. So menstruation then is not the adaptation, but this process of spontaneous decidualization, which is trying to clamp down on the amount that the fetus is trying to kind of get in there before the fetus gets to grab as much as possible of the mother's bloodstream, is what is doing. So our menstruating species are, so far as we can tell, the Hema Coryell invasive placentation species, which have this feature of building the endometrium anyway, whether or not they're going to get pregnant, as a precaution against the fetus's grab for all those nutrients, is what it is. Okay, and I'm going to show, I just want to say a little bit more before I show this nice little TED talk, which summarizes exactly that. That's all a bit complicated, that biology. But what I want to stress is how extraordinary, when we've talked about the endometrium quite neutrally, but what is quite extraordinary is that this endometrium is not, we would think the inner lining of the womb would be the most friendly nice nurturing place possible for an embryo to implant and become a fetus. But actually it isn't. It's the most lethal, it's a hostile environment, in fact. And you start to scratch your head and think, this is absolutely weird. Why on earth would the inner lining of the womb actually be a place that's very difficult for the embryo and the fetus, the implantation, to survive? And this is where we got to think about the mother's point of view. She is trying to clamp down and control the amount that the fetus can kind of grab from her. But she's also facing, if she's going to get pregnant, she's facing this very long, heavy, costly investment in an offspring through the pregnancy, and then following that, and we're talking really about these primate species that are menstruators, following that a year, 2, 3 more years of, and in the great apes case, 5 years of breastfeeding, lactation to support that offspring. Okay, with that kind of costliness in the investment ahead of her, from the mother's point of view, she wants to make absolutely sure that this embryo that's implanting, this fetus, is the best possible one. It's not just, it's not going to fall, it's going to be the healthiest and best. So what this system is kind of quality control for species with very high reproductive costs. So we've got all these features: Hema Coryell placentation, spontaneous Dissidia Liesation, lay down the endometrium, whether or not you're going to get pregnant, and then this costliness, which means that the endometrium is this hostile environment testing the quality of that fetus, okay, of that implantation. So what is quite extraordinary about the endometrium is that it is restricting, when the placenta tries to implant, it is restricting the blood supply. It is making the tissues very insensitive to the hormonal signals that the fetus, this is why the hormonal signals have to grow incredibly loud as a kind of test of the health of the fetus, because the tissue is not sensitive to the hormonal signals. And actually this can potentially lead, because of the hostility of the environment, the endometrium, we have the problem that's pretty well known in human pregnancy of ectopic implantations, because actually places outside the endometrium may be more friendly. And this is then going to lead to the possibility that we will have implantations that kind of fail, that don't work very well, that may be in the wrong places, where these failed implantations may be emitting signals that are disruptive of the mother's, the whole uterine environment. So all of these things are kind of leading to the endometrium as this kind of nightmare landscape, if you like, of potentially either dead or dying or potentially infected tissue with all these sort of weak signals of these dying little poor. It reminds me of the image from, if you were here with the Sleeping Beauty last week, of all these dead and dying princes on the thorn bushes. It's a little bit like that, metaphorically speaking. And there's one additional factor as well, which may be part of the characteristics of the species which menstruate. And this is the aspect of their sexual reproduction, that they have sex, what's known as continuous sexual receptivity. Now this is well known amongst monkeys and apes, as well as us, obviously. We are the champion menstruators, and we are the champion having sex anytime around the cycle. But most of the monkeys and apes are well capable of sex at different times of cycle. And some of the research on those bat species is suggesting they also have continuous receptivity. Now, why does that add into this selection pressure on menstruation and the discard of the endometrium? If you think about having continuous sexual receptivity implies that it's quite possible for to have sex and to have gametes, male gametes, sperm, floating about in the system that have come from quite a few days ago. They may be quite old, they may be getting a little bit doddery, and if a fertilization occurs with aging gametes, there may be more likelihood of chromosomal abnormalities. So we've got all these factors making the endometrium's kind of hostility to implantation, leading to possibilities of ectopic pregnancy, possibilities of chromosomal abnormalities because of continuous receptivity, all this kind of disruption of that endometrium environment. So if the implantations have failed, simply the best thing to do, this is a kind of rough and ready solution that natural selection has produced, is it didn't work, okay, just get rid of the lot. Start again, clean sheet. So that's menstruation. Get rid of the inner linings, the sort of, it's about a third or so of the tissue in the inner lining from the endometrium, get rid of it, and then you can start another cycle of building it up. Now it may be costly, it may seem wasteful, but it gets rid of all the potential problems from this system of this spontaneous decidualization and the risks that are being run of ectopic pregnancies, the sexual receptivity making a more risky chromosomal abnormality. Okay, so I hope that you got the picture on that. It's quite complicated, so what I'm going to do is just let you watch this little, it's only a few minutes, but it summarizes what I've just said in terms of humans. So it should help you get the whole thing, if I can. It's less than 5 minutes here.
Species on Earth share a mysterious trait, a menstrual cycle. A menstrual cycle. We're one of the select.
Sorry, what's happened?
Bats, cats, and
Oh.
possibly elephant shrews are
Sorry.
the only mammals on Earth that menstruate.
Oh,
We
okay,
also
I've got
do it
two,
more than
yeah.
any other animal,
Sorry,
even though it's a waste of nutrients.
let me
and
go
can be
back.
physical.
Is that just one? Okay. Pulled it up too much.
A handful of species on Earth share a seemingly mysterious trait, a menstrual cycle. We're one of the select few. Monkeys, apes, bats, humans, and possibly elephant shrews are the only mammals on Earth that menstruate. We also do it more than any other animal, even though it's a waste of nutrients and can be a physical inconvenience. So where's the sense in this uncommon biological process? The answer begins with pregnancy. During this process, the body's resources are cleverly used to shape a suitable environment for a fetus, creating an internal haven for a mother to nurture her growing child. In this respect, pregnancy is awe-inspiring, but that's only half the story. The other half reveals that pregnancy places a mother and her child at odds. As for all living creatures, the human body evolved to promote the spread of its genes. For the mother, that means she should try to provide equally for all her offspring. But a mother and her fetus don't share exactly the same genes. The fetus inherits genes from its father as well, and those genes can promote their own survival by extracting more than their fair share of resources from the mother. This evolutionary conflict of interests places a woman and her unborn child in a biological tug of war that plays out inside the womb. One factor contributing to this internal tussle is the placenta, the fetal organ that connects to the mother's blood supply and nourishes the fetus while it grows. In most mammals, the placenta is confined behind a barrier of maternal cells. This barrier lets the mother control the supply of nutrients to the fetus. But in humans and a few other species, the placenta actually penetrates right into the mother's circulatory system to directly access her bloodstream. Through its placenta, the fetus pumps the mother's arteries with hormones that keep them open to provide a permanent flow of nutrient-rich blood. A fetus with such unrestricted access can manufacture hormones to increase the mother's blood sugar, dilate her arteries, and inflate her blood pressure. Most mammal mothers can expel or reabsorb embryos if required, but in humans, once the fetus is connected to the blood supply, severing that connection can result in hemorrhage. If the fetus develops poorly or dies, the mother's health is endangered. As it grows, a fetus's ongoing need for resources can cause intense fatigue, high blood pressure, and conditions like diabetes and preeclampsia. Because of these risks, pregnancy is always a huge and sometimes dangerous investment. So it makes sense that the body should screen embryos carefully to find out which ones are worth the challenge. This is where menstruation fits in. Pregnancy starts with a process called implantation, where the embryo embeds itself in the endometrium that lines the uterus. The endometrium evolved to make implantation difficult, so that only the healthy embryos could survive. But in doing so, it also selected for the most vigorously invasive embryos, creating an evolutionary feedback loop. The embryo engages in a complex, exquisitely timed hormonal dialogue that transforms the endometrium to allow implantation. What happens when an embryo fails the test? It might still manage to attach, or even get partly through the endometrium. As it slowly dies, it could leave its mother vulnerable to infection. And all the time, it may be emitting hormonal signals that disrupt her tissues. The body avoids this problem by simply removing every possible risk. Each time ovulation doesn't result in a healthy pregnancy, the womb gets rid of its endometrial lining, along with any unfertilized eggs, sick, dying, or dead embryos. That protective process is known as menstruation, leading to the period. This biological trait, bizarre as it may be, sets us on course for the continuation of the human race.
Okay, so yeah, that's quite a nice little summary of, and this is the paper, this Hema et al. Paper, which really put out the hypothesis of menstruation in terms of maternal-fetal conflict, and if anyone's interested, I could send that along. Now, it was saying there that the more that the endometrium gets tough for the fetus, there's going to be another evolutionary arms race going on of the fetus needing to kind of hang in there for even harder, so it becomes even more aggressive. So there's a kind of increased arms race, which I would guess is going to correlate to some extent to the extent of the costliness of encephalization, of the costs for mothers as they have to raise increasingly large-brained offspring, which is why we kind of have the worst of it compared to our great-ape cousins, who are the next biggest menstruators compared to the monkeys. But yes, those are the key factors. So now those are the key factors in determining which are the menstruating species. So that seems to be a good explanation, potentially. Now I'm going to turn to looking at what menstruation might have done in our human ancestry, and come out with some ideas about menstruation's importance as a kind of signal. But first of all, it's quite important to get a grip on the fact that ours as kind of women leading Western lifestyle, those of us who are still in menstrual reproductive years, we are not typical of the human race. We are known as weird people, Western, educated in some ways, industrial, rich, and supposedly democratic. I'm not sure that democratic is a very good adjective for it, but anyway, weird people. We aren't very typical of most of the rest of the world. And looking at data from women in natural fertility populations that are not using contraceptives and are going through pretty natural kind of organism reproductive cycles, menstrual cycles, getting pregnant, doing breastfeeding for sort of standard amounts of time. And so that has been put on these charts as a postpartum, after birth, amenorrhea, when the energy levels of women in societies like the Dogon of Mali the Kalasha of Hindu Kush. So these are food-limited subsistence societies where women who are breastfeeding are quite energetically challenged, and they're unlikely to be menstruating for the part of heavy breastfeeding. And these are a couple of different studies. The top was collected by Beverly Strassman, who's done some wonderful work on the biology and menstruation with the Dogon people in Mali. Women of peak reproductive age, covering a 2-year period. She's getting in the order of 15% women. When I say menstruating, that means experiencing menstrual cycles. That doesn't mean all the time menstruating. That means experiencing menstrual cycles. About a third being actually pregnant during that time, and something like 60% of breastfeeding. Gives you a bit more idea of how that breaks down. The Kalasha measured slightly differently, taking women from their first pregnancy right through to the end of the breastfeeding of the last pregnancy. But they've again got, it's between 10 and 15% menstruating, menstrual cycles. Pregnancy, there's a bit more pregnancy with this being measured, but it's a third to 40%, and about half of the postpartum amenorrhea. So this is a much more typical profile than would be found amongst Western women. I'll come back to the issue of menstruation with Western women, I hope, if there's time at the end, or if there is in question time. Now, what differentiates all of these all human populations? The period of breastfeeding is significantly affected by the fact that all human populations, one way or another, we have what is called cooperative childcare. A mother is not alone in raising her offspring. Whoever it is who may be the main helper of that, it could be her female relatives, it could be a man or husband, or combinations of those, but there is cooperation. And that has very significantly shifted human reproduction compared to great ape reproduction. And the part that has especially changed is the breastfeeding part. This is, for these women, half or more of the time spent breastfeeding, but compared to great apes, that is much less. A great ape mother, for the simple reason that she does the entire job herself of raising her offspring, has to spend an awful long time of breastfeeding. A chimpanzee, 4 to 5 years, whereas for a human, it's in the natural fertility would be in the order 2.5 to 3 years, likely. Gorillas or orangutans can be 6 or 7 years of breastfeeding. It's an extortionately long period of time. It's a huge investment for the mother. Now, what that implies is that the amount of the proportion of the reproductive life that's actually menstrual cycles is larger for humans. We are the champion menstruators, not only in terms of quantity of menstruation which we produce, but also the number of times. We're going to look a bit more closely at the number of times for like a hunter-gatherer population perhaps, but this is a shift of human reproduction. We just have more menstruation happening for us compared to great apes. Okay, so let's just think about that in terms of a hominin reproduction. I've put a chart which has the fossils through hominin evolution, starting from Australopithecine type species, going back way before 3 million years, but into the 3 to 2 million years. And one of the points here is that they have fundamentally brain sizes about the same as chimpanzee level, pretty similar. And that is the brain size that seems to be constrained on a grey ceiling. They can't actually raise the brain size any higher than that. And that is for the reason that I've just mentioned, that a great ape mother is by herself. If she's by herself, there's a limit to how large a brain. Brains are incredibly expensive to raise in children for the mother. If she's by herself and she's got to produce all the energy, then she is going to be constrained. And that is what's happened for Australopithecines. So what that implies is that those Australopithecines have the same kind of reproductive, very long periods of breastfeeding, very likely, as the great apes did. But something truly changed in about 2 million or so years with the emergence of genus Homo, our genus. We smashed through what's called the grey ceiling. And that has been hypothesized as people like Sarah Hrdy as connected to cooperative childcare, that mothers were no longer alone and they therefore had somebody helping, supporting them, somebody supporting them and able to raise offspring with these larger brains. So this is implying that with that genus Homo, the breastfeeding portion of the reproductive lifespan closes, it narrows down, it becomes shorter relatively. The menstruating cycles become relatively more of the reproductive lifetime. Now there's one other important thing to discuss is the continuous sexual receptivity. Because we've said that that is significant for monkeys and apes, and we've said that it is significant in the evolution of menstruation, very likely. Now, it's worth just understanding why continuous sexual receptivity would have very probably already been here, down here, with the great apes. I mean, great apes have certain levels of continuous receptivity. One of the fundamental reasons for it is to do with the risks the female has. Why do female primates try to have sex with males when they're not going to have necessarily going to get pregnant? They try to have sex with males at other times of the cycle. And the fundamental reason may be because they're trying to fool males about paternity, or whether or not they're the fathers. And the main reason for that is that the biggest cost female primates face is the risk of infanticide. And there's an example with the famous Hanuman langurs, the temple monkeys in India, which you may have seen films where males who are not the males who are the harem males of the group, they're outsider males. A male comes in, takes over the harem from another male, chases that male away, and he will systematically start killing the babies, any babies there, and he will kill babies born for the next 6 months because his genes, his body knows those aren't his babies, and he will do that. And he's only doing that in order to get the females to start menstrual cycling, to start ovulatory cycling again, so that he can mate them and have babies. Now that is, infanticide of that order is found amongst monkeys, it's found amongst great apes, and it would have been an issue for our hominin ancestors as well. Continuous sexual receptivity, females trying to have sex all the different stages of the cycle, kind of fooling males into thinking they might be the daddy, is an ancient primate female strategy. So when we're putting menstruation and continuous sexual receptivity together, it would have been definitely already there in Australopithecines, but it would be almost surely becoming an even more significant strategy for our Homo ancestors in Homo evolution. Okay, so let's just go down the actual signals. I'm going to talk about menstruation as a signal now, and modern human, we have the evidence in modern human bodies, our own bodies, of these signals, and we can infer that those signals are likely to have been part of earlier Homo mating systems as well. First of all, we do not show ovulation, or we certainly don't make it very clear to the men in our lives, if we have men in our lives, when we're ovulating. And there's a very, very good reason for that. That if a male knows exactly when a female is going to be fertile, then okay, he can just turn up, wham bam, thank you ma'am, and then he can go off and find the next one. And it's quite clear that in all that we've been talking about, cooperative childcare, human females and their ancestors have for long, long, long time been evolving to get males involved in reproduction in ways that they aren't amongst great apes. So fathers in human cultures can go from 0 to hero. They have an incredible variability in the amount that they contribute, but if females want males to hang around, concealing ovulation is a very good way to make them hang around because they don't know exactly when a female might be. And if you combine that with continuous sexual receptivity, then you're really confusing him. You're scrambling information to males about exactly when you're fertile. You're keeping him hanging around. The more he hangs around and actually sort of makes himself useful and hangs around, the more chances he actually gets of being the daddy. So that's kind of works for both sides. So if a male is useful, then kind of everyone wants one. And concealing ovulation, having lots of sex is a good way to keep hold of one. But, or maybe we differ on that. We don't have to do this. But what that leaves is a system where we're not showing the time of ovulation. We are confusing the issue of whether we want sex or not. We can say yes or we can say no. Menstruation now, and we are the champion. We are producing a lot of we are menstruating a lot compared to great apes, a number of times. And also we menstruate very salient quantities. And now menstruation is left. It's a cue that the female is not pregnant. It is pretty clearly showing to a male that the female's not pregnant, but it is also telling him she can become pregnant in the near future. And they're going to work that out pretty quickly. So menstruation is now, from this point of view, an extremely powerful signal. If we're in a Darwinian world where males are seeking females to fertilize and trying to gain reproductive success, if that's our world for the evolution of genus Homo, then no male can ignore this signal of menstruation. It's very powerful. It's telling him out of a population of females that are pregnant, that are breastfeeding or menopausal, the ones who are menstruating, well, if you're going to focus, if you're going to try and attract anyone's attention, if you're going to bring flowers and chocolates, it will be to those girls, okay? They are the ones to target. So we're going to get a situation in genus Homo evolution where amongst the female circles, amongst the females who are, some of them, in most populations, only about a third, we saw the figures actually, less than a third are menstrual at any one time. It's more like 15% or something, and menstrual at any one time. So the other females not showing menstrual cycles, this is potentially a cause of serious conflict and disruption. A female who is menstruating would use that signal to attract attention. If she wants to attract attention from any particular male for whatever reason, she can do that. And that may well have been the case amongst Homo erectus kind of early stages of this very prominent menstrual signaling. And so these females might be relatives and friends of each other, but any one female menstruating whilst the others are pregnant, she's possibly going to take investment away that those pregnant and breastfeeding females need. So this is a potential source of conflict. And amongst the males, it's a potential source of conflict that they are likely to be competitive for any female who's menstruating to get attention to her. So menstruation becomes this signal, very powerful, and also potentially going to divide the society, going to cause problems of disruption. Okay. Right, so I'm just going to flip back onto that chart, and I'm going to say, okay, in this stage, 2 million genus Homo erectus, evolution, you can see that the brain size, it kind of hovers, it kind of stays pretty stable over 2 times the chimpanzee volume. And then something extraordinary happens within the last million years, and we're looking at species that has been called heidelbergensis, but we'll hear more from Chris Stringer about that. Right up to the brain sizes of modern humans and Neanderthals, and it would be also the Denisovans, very high brain volumes, way over 3 times chimpanzee brain volumes. Now, what I'm arguing is that if cooperative childcare with maybe female relatives, a bit of help from the males, but not totally reliable males, might account for this phase. But when it comes to that late phase of evolution, something needs to be done about the menstrual signal and what it can do. So I'm predicting that the last 500,000 or so years, strategy will switch into what is a proto-cultural, proto-symbolic strategy. I'm just going to show you what I think it looked like. So, okay, these are friends and relatives of a girl who's menstruating for the first time or the second time or whatever. She's starting to menstruate at a young age. What do? Well, the last thing you want is for those males to grab her, take her anywhere. So you've got to protect her, get control to make sure that she stays with you, she doesn't get taken off by some male on safari. And there are basically 2 things you can do. You can try and hide the fact she's menstruating, or do something quite different. And this is the cosmetic strategy, where all the females bond together, join together, and demonstrate with cosmetic means, using maybe in the first place things like animal blood or any kind of colour, red berry juice or something, demonstrate that they're menstruating to the males, and in the meantime, the actual menstrual females kind of in amongst them. And the males there are portraying them as being kind of puzzled. That isn't really what's going on with that. The males are very, very interested in this fantastic display, cosmetic display by the females. Males who are willing to be investors to do work for females will be interested in cooperating with these cosmetically decorated females. I'll tell more about that next time. But this is what it's looking like. And this is an example from Himba women in Namibia who dress this beautifully with these red ochre, daily with this red ochre, performing a ritual which is a premarital ritual. It doesn't necessarily refer directly to menstruation per se, but we can see that there's a kind of continuity of the signal here. And these women are absolutely, the signal that they're demonstrating to the men who are watching this display is, you're not going to pick and choose between any of us. We are absolutely in solidarity. So we could call this a ritual or cultural form of menstrual synchrony. I'll talk a little bit about menstrual synchrony in the beginning. And the Himba they grind their ochre, they use it in their rituals, so forth. This is a very good example of what I've called female cosmetic coalitions. Now if we look, I'm just going to offer a couple of predictions from that idea, that model, that the very first form of ritual will be females cosmetically manipulating, if you like, producing menstrual signals in relation to females that actually are menstruating. And the predictions out of that are that the very first type of symbolic behavior, manipulation of symbolic media, will be focused on blood red pigments, is a prediction. And that I expect it to happen in relation to the encephalization, the steep rise of the brain size as it's going up in that window, that time period, which is previous to and whilst we are speciating, whilst we're becoming Homo sapiens. We can talk about Neanderthals another time. So I'm just going to show you a little bit, a tiny bit. How much time have we got here? Oh, I'll try and finish in about 10 minutes. If we do just a little bit about, I'll leave those two We are going to hear much more about the archaeology of human origins from one of the world's leading experts of red ochre, Ian Watts, on November the 12th, who's visiting at that time. And we do have a record. It actually goes a bit earlier than 300,000, but it's covering 300,000 right through the time of our speciation, these fossils in Africa, in the Middle Stone Age of Africa, with a focus on grinding red ochre and producing red ochre. And the interpretation of this is that this may be amongst the earliest human ritual traditions. This is a famous piece of ochre that's been engraved from Blombos Cave down right at the southern tip of South Africa. Ian actually helped with the excavation. Ian Watts helped with the excavation of some of these pieces, and he will tell you a lot more about it. But all I'm saying here, in terms of the biology, the signaling of menstruation, or the explanation, the Darwinian explanation, there actually is no other evolutionary hypothesis for why modern humans, as they emerge, have massive signature of red ochre, and everywhere that modern humans go around the world, they carry that signal with them, whether they're going to Australia, into Asia, into Europe, to the Upper Paleolithic, masses of red ochre, and to the Americas when it happens too, masses of red ochre. Okay, can I do another 10 minutes? Is it good,
Yes,
Chris?
yes,
Just to wind it, just to introduce, I'm not going to do any more art and cosmology here now because I'll talk more about that later. I'm arguing that this model explains the origin of art, and I'll do much more of that in the other lecture in December. How many women in this room believe they have experience of menstrual synchrony? Is that most of the women? It might be easier to answer, to ask how many don't think so. It's at least a majority. I think it's a majority. Okay. There is a beautiful study by a woman called Brienne Fars, who looked into women's, this is in, where is it, Indiana? I can't remember exactly now, in the Middle America somewhere. And she's showing that women very strongly believe that they link up with menstrual synchrony with their friends or women that they feel very, it's linked to, and that this is a kind of body expression of their solidarity, of their emotional connection, and most of all, their solidarity against all the scientists who refuse to believe it exists. And currently the state of the science is that all these studies which have shown existence of synchrony are statistically flawed, and that there is no scientific proof, and rather there's disproof. That yes, there will be certain amount of random overlapping of menstrual cycles, but that any tendency of a group of women who is cycling at sort of different times, tending towards synchronizing, it just doesn't, it's not, it's all in the mind, these poor dears. Okay, so I'm going to ask this question, does menstrual synchrony exist, and why actually I think it must do, and why women are reporting on real material phenomena. To the question of the lunar cycle length. Maybe some of you doing Sleeping Beauty last week with the 13 silver plates and the lunar cycle. Is that a myth too? Because in almost all the indigenous cultures, the etymology links the moon and menstruation, as in the Proto-Indo-European links. And I'm going to use the very most up-to-date papers which have been gathering data from menstrual apps. How many women here are doing menstrual apps? So, yeah, quite a few. Okay, you could be maybe participant in these studies. Okay, right. Don't worry about how complex that chart is. I'm just looking at this end. And what that is measuring is just the number of menstrual cycles in a lifetime. And it's a model. It's not actual data. It's a kind of hypothetical model. You can see that column, way over 400 menstrual cycles. And that column's representing a weird woman, a Western lifestyle woman. Might be different ethnicities, but they're basically Western lifestyle. Way over 400. These are historic estimates. That this is like a woman at the end of the Victorian period. She's got about half as many cycles. And if you think about all that Victorian symbolism of the vampires and the women falling faint and needing to go and lie down in darkened rooms, I suggest that this big jump of menstrual cycles has something to do with it. And that's an older historic, but this is a hunter-gatherer model. So hunter-gatherer women, the jeune poissy, who would be more representative of evolutionary lifestyle than any of the other women there. Less than 180, 70 menstrual cycles in a lifetime. The reason being, she starts menarche later. She will get pregnant very much sooner than a Western woman today. She will have more pregnancies, maybe 6, 7, 8, perhaps maybe losing 1 or 2 children. And she will be breastfeeding much longer. For all those reasons, she has about 1/5 of the number of cycles that a weird woman today does. Okay. Weird women are menstruating more than any women in history or prehistory ever. The weird women may be gathering in social groups and collectivities of much more popular, dense populations, congregations, thinking women in the workplace, women in schools, dormitories, colleges. So there are so many menstrual cycles that it's inevitable women will be overlapping those cycles, massively more so than would actually be happening in a hunter-gatherer camp. Okay? So if women believe that they're experiencing menstrual synchrony, it almost surely is because, yes, they actually are, because there are just so many menstrual cycles around. And they're picking up on that, especially the more so as the taboos of kind of Christian cultures of reticence of menstruation break down, as a feminist consciousness arises, women will be more attuned to that, which is something that Brian Farrs does argue. But this is for sure. Okay, now I'm just going to show you some of the menstrual app data, because this is the great paper that really, real-world menstrual cycle characteristics. They've collected data for over 1 million menstrual cycles on this, and they've honed it down because this is actually Natural Cycles app. Does anyone use Natural Cycles app? It may be based more in Sweden. These are Swedish researchers, I don't know, but what is interesting about this is that it's measuring the body temperature, and as you see the follicular phase, the body temperature before ovulation is lower, and then it kicks up at ovulation, and then it's higher, which means that they are able, as women enter their data, the dates of menstruation, their body temperature data, the app is detecting ovulation pretty reliably, okay? And that means that they have been able to home in on ovulatory cycles and collect menstrual cycle lengths from cycles that were fertile, right? Now the interesting thing is, I'm going to cheer here. We saw the earlier chart had a 28-day model. This chart, for the first time, breaks through to 29-day model. Anybody who tries to tell you that 28 days is the normal or mean length of menstrual cycle, I hope you're going to be able to argue back to them by the end of this, because no, it isn't. That doesn't mean there will be women experiencing 28-day cycles. But it isn't, if you average large numbers of cycles, it isn't going to be the mean. It may be more typical for women later in their 30s than in their 20s, 28. There is no such thing as normal menstrual cycle. All women who menstruate will have variability within, quite a few days, standard deviation either side of normal, sort of average cycle length. And between women, there will be variability. But what I'm trying to get at is there actually grounds for looking for a lunar factor in menstruation? Okay, now I'm just going to go back. I want to find that paper, if I can, just show you some data from it, if it's big enough. All right. So what they could do in this paper was a number of... I thoroughly recommend any woman, actually, to have a look at the paper, because it does give some interesting stuff about whether you're trying to get pregnant or trying to avoid pregnancy. It's very worth taking a look at and getting genned up on. But I'm just going to point to a few things. So this is breaking down cycle lengths. They took cycles from 15 days up to 50. Anything longer than that they thought probably wasn't menstruation. It might have been something else. And 600,000 in all. The vast majority, if we look at here, these categories, the vast majority of menstrual cycle lengths are falling between 25 and 35, basically, if we just look at the percentage of cycles. Okay, now this is the kind of crunch. Whoops, sorry, I'm going too fast. Over all cycles, 600,000 of them, the ones that were fertile, 29.3 is coming up as the average, the mean, with a standard variation, 5 days either side. Okay, but if you look at the age cohorts, the early, younger women, quite long, really long, 30, still 29.9, nearly 30 in those women at late 20s, and then in 30, we get the 28 coming for women late 30s there. Okay. But you're changing through age, reducing the average, and that they're able to show goes with the follicular phase reducing. They're able to show that on these charts. We haven't exactly got the lunar number there, but I'm going to show you where I think it is, or where I think the kind of reason for thinking there could be an evolutionary connection lies, because they did one other type of analysis here, and it was on factoring in, if I can find it, sorry, where are we? This is it. Okay, BMI, which is an indicator of weight, body weight factored by height. So it is kilograms mass divided by meters squared, the height in meters times 2 squared. Right, and we've got that 29.3 again for these women that are supposedly the normal range of BMI here. This is given as normal range for, but again, it's for weird women, for Western women, okay, in our very energetic, affluent society. If we look at the lower range of BMI, then this may be much more typical for evolutionary ancestors. The women that would have the sort of BMI range that women in evolution who would be much more energetically challenged, possibly needing to wait for seasonal availability of food supplies to be able to get energy for reproduction, to have ovulatory cycles, to get pregnant, to support breastfeeding. And what I'm suggesting is that the BMI factor, if you factor together the lower edge of BMI for this category, supposedly normal, with the low end, the underweight category there, you're going to come up with mean menstrual cycles of the lunar length. So it is suggesting that there is a lunar cycle factor there. And then we consider pregnancy and its average length may be a multiple of that lunar cycle factor. So really, why should there be? What's for? Why should there be any kind of lunar feature in human reproduction? Chris has talked about it earlier, this term, I think. We hominins, African hominins in our evolution would have been in savanna environments where there were many, many predators, of very, very scary predators, lions, hyenas, saber-toothed cats, whose nocturnal vision is superb compared to human hominin vision. And in very dark nights, when there's no moon in the sky, you don't want to be you don't want to be traveling around, you don't want to be, the time when you would want to be trying to sneak off to visit your boyfriend or girlfriend would definitely be when there was light in the sky. So there's a very powerful reason why, and this would be ovulation, would be tying itself, or natural selection would select those hominins whose ovulation, those female hominins whose ovulation tended to be at that time, bright moonlight in the sky, which would imply menstruation would be at the other phase of the moon, dark moon. But what about synchrony? If there is a correlation of menstrual cycles to lunar length, what about synchrony? What about reproductive synchrony? Well, reproductive synchrony is well known amongst primate females, female primates like the langur monkeys I mentioned, because it's the technique by which females bust up harems. If they don't want to have a dominant male dominating, monopolizing fertile cycles of a bunch of females, they synchronize their cycles. And if they synchronize their cycles, then other males will come and join into the mating system. Okay, so actually female primates can play this either way. Maybe they do just want one male because the other males would eat their food supply. And if they do just want one male, they'll pick the male and they will desynchronize. They will give the male good information about when they're likely to be fertile and let him just get on with it. So there's plenty of sperm to fertilize a lot of them. But if they want one male each, the best thing to do is to synchronize their cycles, and then any single male cannot hold a harem. And this is well known with primates. Any form of reproductive synchrony, either on ovulatory cycles or on seasonality, will cause that. So now we have the prospect that women who are experiencing menstrual synchrony in an office or any environment where they're collected, they're actually pursuing very ancient strategies of our ancestors who are aiming to undermine any single male dominating. So they're kind of undermining any potential of sexual harassment by the boss or whoever in those environments, and they're pursuing those ancient strategies. Of course, it may not be adaptive today, but as we were discussing earlier, Martha McClintock, who originally documented menstrual synchrony, was suggesting that what menstrual synchrony may be is some kind of ancestral, some kind of fossil. So it's referring to some ancient strategy that we still have. In fact, we have provided in our modern society the conditions where we will experience more menstrual synchrony than ever would have been amongst our ancestors. I think that's enough for now. Thank you.